Gladiator. The games were held in an amphitheater hewn from living rock on a volcanic islet not far from the mainland. Laidlaw was quickly ushered off into a group of priests, and Morse found that he was to share a seat in the royal lodge between the two monarchs. Rana claimed his attentions immediately. Morse looked to Chiron, who merely shrugged and smiled. But when the opportunity afforded itself, he whispered, "Beware of the flower of everlasting sleep. Do not inhale the fragrance. It intoxicates, but it is fatal." The Atlantean Games opened with a procession of maidens, singing and bearing great armfuls of flowers with which they strewed the arena. Trumpeters with long-necked instruments circled the arena, accompanied by a band of priests. They halted at the royal lodge and hailed its occupants by name. Morse was surprised to hear himself included. A second halt was made on the opposite side of the arena before a purple canopy. Morse was able to make out the figure of Ru, and beside him Laidlaw, as the hailing ceremony was repeated. A strange perfume arose from the crushed petals that filled the arena. The air was clear, and the rays of the sun were warm and dazzling for the mid-afternoon spectacle. Morse fought to stay clear of Rana's intense being and a repetition of their first meeting. He concentrated on the arena, asked questions profusely, and finally with a slight smile Chiron came to his aid, to the obvious displeasure of his co-ruler. The monarch spoke of many things, of traditions and ancient festivals, of horses unknown in New Atlantis and known only through the lore of the past, of cattle. Chiron revealed that they possessed cattle, but their herd had shrunk and bulls were a scarcity. They were used only upon very special occasions, of which this is one, he added diplomatically. A quartet of foot races began the arena activities, and when they had been completed wreaths of gilded leaves were bestowed upon the victors by the monarchs. Immediately following, a bull made its appearance. It was a magnificent creature, white, spotted with black, with gilded horns and hoofs, and a garland of roses about its neck. The crowd acclaimed it, calling it by name as if it was some stage favorite. To those who were thirsty for bloodletting, this was a disappointment. Bulls were too scarce to be killed and served merely as a motive for an exhibition of marvelous agility. Youths and maidens armed with long spears and shorter darts attacked the brute, but the points of their weapons were short, and hardly drew blood. The bull was driven into a frenzy and finally into a sullen fit. A girl vaulted lightly to its neck, seized its horns, and rode off in triumph as her companions prodded the creature to an exit. The gladiatorial games that followed provided the cue for general excitement. The weapons were real and the men in earnest. They fought in bands at first, then in couples, a javelin thrower, clad only in a linen breechcloth, protected by a partner with broad-bladed sword and a shield almost as long as himself. So dexterous were they that few serious wounds were dealt in the minutes allowed to each bout by the arena master. Still, there was blood enough to bring fierce shouts from their adherents on the benches. Morse turned away from the action. He saw the beautiful mouth of Rana take on cruel lines, saw her eyes glaze with crimson like some fierce beast. There was no hypnosis here. Morse knew Rana now, knew she could never hold him in trance again. He turned to Chiron, who watched somewhat wearily, while making expert comments on the moves of the battlers. The finest gladiators had been reserved for single combat, and the crowd shouted for its favorites. Occasionally, a winner, still breathing heavily, would advance to a spot before a group of nobles and offer a challenge to the amateurs. There would be a pause, and finally a young aristocrat would rise, cast away his outer garments amidst the cheers of the spectators, and descend to the arena. At times, the professionals were hard-pressed, but for the most part they treated their opponents with a good-humored tolerance born of conscious superiority. Last of all came the boxers, deep-chested giants of heavier mold, men who flailed at each other within the limits of a square indicated by upright posts. Their hands were protected with leather bands bound about the knuckles, fastened at the wrists, and studded with bronze. Two slaves fought ferociously for a prize of freedom, one felling the other with a savage blow upon the temple, and watching with a grin as the loser was dragged away, dying and insensible. The Atlanteans fought strict save for the cestus on the knuckles, and adhered to rules that precluded wrestling and kicking. The fights ended with one combatant owning himself beaten or unable to continue. The winners that came for their victory wreaths were badly bruised, but apparently they were Rana's favorites, for she added to their wreaths gold coins from a bag brought by an attendant. Few of the boxers challenged the spectators, and there were no takers, a fact which brought jeers of derision from the populace. Apparently they were not keen to face a possible disfigurement or bad beating. The final bout ended with a victory for the champion of Atlantis. He was a massive man, weighing well over 250 pounds, his powerful body a mass of gnarled muscles and brute strength. The sympathy of the spectators was with his opponent, a lighter, younger man who circled about his foe, raining upon him a torrent of quick swinging blows. The champion waited patiently, dodging and guarding some of the blows, but taking many full upon his features. Finally, the lighter man slowed his attack, breathing heavily from his exertions. And this seemed to be a signal for the champion's strategy. He leaped forward with ponderous arms swinging, too suddenly for his tired opponent to dodge completely away. A glancing blow slowed him, and then one great blow from the champion caught the challenger full on the base of the skull. The latter crumpled without a sound. The victor advanced with a lurching swagger toward the royal box. His bestial features, scarred in earlier fights, were livid and bruised where the blows of his most recent opponent had gone home. Tiny, pig-like eyes glared at Morse from beneath scarred brows. A trickle of blood dripped from his nose, but the broad chest of the fighter rose and fell evenly, as if he had not even exerted himself. "So, Aulus, you are still champion," said Rana as she bent to place the wreath upon the low brow and dropped some clinking coins into the cestus-bound palm. "This is but a tithe I won on you from the king today." "I have always contested that Aulus is clumsy," said Chiron, as casually as if he had been discussing the points of a hound. "Someday a quicker, more intelligent man will come along." Diagoras was beaten before he tied on his cestus, beaten by a title. "Which I still hold," grinned Aulus. "Diagoras will fight no more." I struck the marrow from his spine. Aulus is still champion unless, he hesitated for a moment, as if fearful of his own boldness, unless someone should lift this and take away my wreath. He stepped back, took off the blood-stained cestus from his left hand, raised it toward Morse, looking straight at him, and flung it to the sand in front of the royal box. There could be no mistaking the directness of the challenge, nor the taunting leer in the gladiator's eyes. The arena caught the situation as one person and grew silent. Morse felt himself the target of 1,000 eyes. Beside him, Rana leaned forward, her lips parted, her eyes bent upon his face. Across the wide arena he could distinguish Laidlaw standing upon his feet. Chiron touched his arm and whispered to him. With Aulus still glaring at him, the silence was overwhelming. Morse dimly caught some words, "A trick of you." But his blood was mounting under the eyes of the champion. If there was some trick, the only way to circumvent it would be to beat the champion at his own game or lose all prestige for himself and Laidlaw. He rose, and the spectators lost their silence. They rose with him, cheered, pushed, and the arena became a bedlam. Morse vaulted lightly onto the victor's platform, ran down the steps to where the cestus lay, and held it aloft. The dark eyes of Rana caught his own. They tried to see into them, and a baffled look passed over the beautiful face. Morse knew that she was trying to calculate his chances of victory. She looked for fear, for courage, for stupidity, and looked for other intangibles. And Morse knew that she sought nothing. The noise of the arena gradually subsided, and Chiron's modulated voice called, "Thrice the amount of the bet against Aulus once again, Rana." And Morse was surprised by the answer. "You tempt me to discourtesy. I wager on our guest." At these words, the face of Aulus turned into a scowl. He took up the cestus that Morse tossed upon the platform, and looked long into the crowd. Morse had turned without a word and followed the arena master into the gymnasium. Strange butterflies crawled within his stomach, for he was not one to seek out a fight. Still, he told himself, the Atlantean boxers were clumsy punchers. He believed in his own skill, and he had taken lessons from modern experts. Morse hoped that his boxing ability, his speed of hand and foot, and his conditioning would offset the superior weight and brute strength of Aulus. The American was seized with an intense desire to defeat this swaggerer, and his butterflies disappeared. In the gymnasium he stripped to a loincloth and allowed himself to be rubbed with oils by a sad-eyed man who proclaimed himself the trainer of the slain Diagoras. When it came time to don the cestus, there were none save those belonging to the gladiators. "Give me those of Diagoras," said Morse. The trainer brought them reluctantly. "I fear that they are covered with misfortune," he said. "They are covered with the blood of Aulus," replied Morse grimly. "More of it will wipe away the evil." "That is well spoken," said the trainer, and then in an aside, "Beware of his right arm. And if he appears to weaken in any way, then be most wary." Morse nodded understanding and stepped into the arena, knowing now that civilization was far behind. A throaty roar greeted him as he crossed the sand. Flowers flung by half the populace littered his path, as many tried to emulate their rulers by making him their favorite. But many were quiet, and Morse knew that they had wagered on the professional. As he advanced, Morse felt a strange sense of exultation, as if some ancestor, or he himself in a former incarnation, had once trod the arena to pit his strength and skill against another's. Aulus waited disdainfully, leaning his bulk against one of the pillars of the fight space. When his opponent was only a few paces away, he coiled suddenly like some great reptile ready to strike. Morse waited expectantly, but the arena master hurried between them, and with a few words led the two before the royal box. Right arms extended, they hailed the monarchs. Rana gazed at them in anticipation of the savage sport that was to follow. The fire of her eyes held those of Aulus, but Morse turned his glance to Chiron's face. The monarch's lips moved silently and quickly, and the American read the words, "Right lower ribs." Accompanied by the arena master, the combatants moved in a measured step to the square that was to be their place of conflict. The two were of a height, but the shoulders of Aulus were broader, and his chest and hips formed a square torso, in distinction to that of Morse, whose frame sloped inward to narrow hips. The American's muscles were long and less visible than those of the professional, and his legs, though well developed, were saplings beside the huge boughs of the Gladiator. Morse's trip through the jungle had left him in fine condition, without an extra ounce of weight. Aulus was a trifle gross with good living, although his wind had seemed excellent in the earlier combat. Morse remembered the wild swings of the Atlantean boxers and planned to treat the populace to an exhibition of jolting straight-arm punches. He hoped they would be a disconcerting surprise to Aulus, who owned a 60-pound weight advantage. Jabbing and footwork, he told himself. The combatants took their places, and after a look to Chiron, the arena master dropped his baton, the signal that commenced the battle. Disdaining his opponent for a moment, Aulus carefully placed his right foot forward, the left hand on guard, and the right hand opposite his breast in the now familiar Atlantean form. Morse opposed him loosely, hands high, poised on both feet ready to move in and out with lightning thrusts. The arena had fallen silent again, and the battlers could hear the chirp of a bird from an outer tier. Aulus stood like a rock, derisively smiling with swollen lips that disclosed teeth broken from cestus blows. Morse felt a fury to erase the mocking grimace. He advanced, feinted with his left, drawing up the right hand of Aulus. Instantly Morse led with his right hand, and followed with a low smash to the ribs, sidestepping the wild counter swings. Aulus grunted as the blow smashed home, and Morse knew that at some time his man had been injured sufficiently for him to favor a spot that might hold a weakness. The cruel cestus studs had ripped the skin, and blood ran down the gladiator's flanks, bringing a shout from the benches. Raging, Aulus wheeled and charged with a flurry of blows. So swift and determined was the attack that Morse had barely time to deliver a straight left hand to the face before he was forced to cover and retreat. The hammering of the great arms, hard as bronze, threatened to smash down his defense. Feeling left his forearms. And while a clinch would have given him a breather, grappling was forbidden in the arena. A roar told him that he had retreated beyond the limits of the square, and he sidestepped nimbly to gain the center. Aulus floundered after him, and Morse saw that he had opened up a flowing wound above the iron on the cheekbone. The Atlantean dashed the blood aside and charged with a thunderous growl, only to run into another straight jab. Morse ducked under a wild swing, and as the gladiator pivoted off balance he was pounded heavily below the heart. Aulus' left eye was closing fast. He bellowed his rage at this agile opponent who fought in so unorthodox a manner. Morse danced in and out with quick, sharp blows, but he did not go untouched. Once a glancing swing had all but paralyzed his shoulder and left arm, and on another occasion the cestus had cut his cheek. He felt the blood dripping down as he countered to the lower ribs and once again got a responsive grunt of pain. Morse's arms ached from blocking punches, but Aulus' face was now a gory mask. And yet there was no weakening to the Atlantean's blows. Aulus now stood in the center of the square, revolving like some clumsy turret as Morse moved around him. His unclosed eye glowered red with a venomous determination, and as Morse planted an uppercut squarely on his jaw, the gladiator shook off the blow with a laugh. The man appeared as invincible as an oak. The sound from the benches seemed far away, as breaking waves on a distant beach, and the American found himself longing for Queensberry rules and the attention of deft seconds during a breathing spell. With a third blow to the ribs, Aulus staggered back, mouth open, face distorted, arms lowered. Morse leaped forward to press his attack. And suddenly the gladiator regained his full strength, his features demoniac with anticipated triumph. Morse knew that he had been lured into the trap against which he had been warned. A smashing blow stung him sideways, and before he could regain his balance another pushed past his guard and caught him over the heart. His lungs failed, the air grew dark, he reeled dizzily. Only the absolute condition of his legs kept him on his feet as he crouched instinctively. Thunder sounded in his ears, and he felt that the end had come. But no blows fell. The mist cleared away, and he looked out from under his guard. Aulus was on the ground. The force of the misjudged blow he had meant to end the combat had brought him crashing to the sand. Morse summoned all his reserve and sprang at him like a tiger. The gladiator was rising from his left knee, his right arm extended upward. There was a livid bruise on the ribs where Morse had made his target, and as Aulus straightened to full height the American punched with all his force to this spot. Aulus groaned and dropped his hands. The blow had cracked his ribs, sending the splintered bone inward. Morse's right hand went home to the jaw, his left to the Adam's apple. The giant tottered. His knees sagged and he confusedly raised one arm to clear the blood from his eyes, now both blinded. Instinctively he tried to protect his head. Morse shifted all his weight to his left foot, and put every ounce of power into a final punch. It caught Aulus between the parting of the ribs, battering the force of its impact through the muscles of the diaphragm. Morse caught the look of unfeigned agony on the chopped countenance and stepped back. The mighty bulk wavered, the coordination between brain and nerve and muscle failed, and he crashed to the ground, a palpitating mass. Morse stood aside as the arena master hurried up. The air was rent with salvos of applause and cries of consternation and disbelief. The official beckoned to the American. Aulus was writhing in pain as Morse bent over him. "It is enough," he cried. "I am undone. Beaten and blind. Bear me away, Milo. I yield my wreath." Chapter 9. The Initiation. Morse was the new idol of the populace. Whenever he appeared, crowds made way for him with cries of admiration, while the maidens, who perpetually wore wreaths of heavy-scented blossoms, cast them before him so that his existence out of doors was almost a continued triumphal procession. And since the games, Rana had increased her attentions. She showered him with gifts and invitations, and all but openly declared herself willing to accept him as lover and husband. Morse could admire her from a distance, for she was unquestionably a beautiful woman. But his fascination for her was gone. She held no spell for him now. And he avoided her as much as possible. Finally, as the month drew to its close, he spoke to Laidlaw. "Look," he said. "I can't take much more of this. I have to work at avoiding her. How soon are you going to be ready to leave?" Laidlaw looked at him in bewildered surprise. "Leave? I haven't even begun my work here. Next week is the start of the month of Pasiphae, the month of Demeter follows. I must observe the festivals and their ritual. They may be close to those of 3,000 years ago. This is an expedition into the past. You can't be serious about leaving at this time. I have 6 months' work in front of me, a year's." So enamored was Laidlaw of his subject that he forgot Morse's appeal. "The only thing that bothers me is the lack of film for the camera. We should have brought a motion picture outfit, Morse. Think of it, tangible proof, the scientific value. Why didn't we bring one?" "I don't want to interrupt your researches," said Morse in a tone that secured the scientist's wandering attention, "but we may have to get away from here in a hurry. You know what Rana's attitude is. I don't think I can be diplomatic toward her much longer without insulting her. Our affairs are going to come to a crisis someday soon, and when I break with her there's going to be trouble. I dodged her last week by staying across the lake, and at that she sent me a letter each day and a jewel which she claims is a vital part of my costume. Rana is as clever as she is beautiful, Laidlaw. Ambitious, too, but she holds nothing for me. She spins a web of circumstance that puts us together, and she may want to make me her consort. But somewhere along the line she's going to try and do away with Chiron, and if this happens Ru is going to be right there. He's either going to control her, or failing that he's going to eliminate her just as she intends to eliminate Chiron." Laidlaw nodded gravely, his work forgotten for the moment. "You may be right. If Ru can assert himself while we're still here, we're going to find ourselves out on the ledge with the vultures some morning, and there won't be any rescue party." The scientist went on slowly. "I've often wondered how genuine her interest in you really is. In the beginning I thought it was feigned, completely so, that she and Ru were working hand in hand against Chiron and against us as well. Now, I'm not so sure about Rana. You're too strong of mind for her, and you baffle her. She's still power-hungry beyond belief, but she can't conquer you, and I believe that this fascinates her. You know Chiron has been anxious to honor us by giving us the full citizenship he promised when we rescued him. Now, I think Rana has come over to this idea as well, while Ru has been quietly working against it all along. You see, if they initiate us to the level of nobles as Chiron intends, it would afford us a little more protection against anything that the old priest might have planned for us. Anyway, I think we have some sort of a conflict growing between Rana and Ru, and you may very well be the cause of it. Laidlaw, if you can see that much, you can see the problems facing us if we stay here." Laidlaw nodded his head sadly. "You're right, of course. But I've got to have a month for my work. Somehow, you've got to smooth things over for that long. Morse, I implore you." Morse had to laugh at the other's seriousness. "All right, then. 1 month. It's not going to be easy. And don't say anything about our intention to depart. We'll have to fly at the last moment, with Chiron's aid if we can get it." As the days passed, Rana took up the cause to ennoble Morse and Laidlaw. Since the former had defeated Aulus in the arena, her interest was, as Laidlaw sensed, more genuine. And when she finally, in a public speech, championed the honor due the visitors, Rut's powerful opposition fell silently away with the applause of the populace. Morse was to receive the second degree of apopty, and Laidlaw, by reason of his dwarfed and misshapen legs, was to receive the slightly lesser degree of misty. Morse wondered how much was due to his companion's imperfections and how much was due to Rana's interest in him. The initiation took place in the underground chambers of the Temple of the Double Axe, dedicated to the sun and moon gods, Minos and Pasiphae. It was midnight on the last day of the month of Minos when Morse and Laidlaw, clad in ceremonial robes, blindfolded, their ears muffled by a light bandage, another across their mouth and nostrils, were escorted by winding ways to the council chamber. 30 silent forms wearing long-sleeved robes of grey that fell over their feet were grouped about a central figure occupying a throne carved from the rock wall. Oil lamps cast a flickering light upon the mute assembly. The silent figures all wore masks representing jaguars, human skulls, and the heads of great beaked birds. The man on the throne was distinguished by a headgear representing a bull. Frescoes dimly showed upon the walls. In the semicircle formed by the initiates stood a glowing brazier supported upon orchid and intertwisting snakes. Incense rose from the green flames of a burning liquid. Morse and Laidlaw were led to a point directly behind it. Neophytes. The voice, despite its resonance, had a strident quality that assured the Americans that Ru was speaking through a megaphone-like object in his mask. You have been instructed in your behavior. Courage conquers all things. Fear breeds weakness. This is the wedding night of Minos, son of Zeus, and god of the sun, and Pasiphae, the all-shining, goddess of the moon, deities of the double axe, founders of Atlantis. As he spoke, the altar flame changed first to orange, then to a vivid blue at the mention of the honored names. May you be found worthy in their sight to become as their children. Your sight, the bandages were removed from their eyes, your hearing and your speech, the other mufflings followed, have been taken from you to be restored as the trials shall prove you fit. Through darkness, danger, and through death the way shall lead back to light and life. Do not step from the trail, or those who lurk close by will seize and destroy you. The light in the brazier died down as the words ceased, flickering to a creeping silver flame that suddenly leaped up and vanished, leaving the chamber in Stygian darkness. By its last lambent effort the Americans could see that the chamber had emptied itself of other occupants in some mysterious fashion. The frescoes wavered on the solid walls as if they shook with the passing of the initiates. They caught a glimpse of the vacant throne before blackness enveloped them. A liquid substance began to drip, spat upon the pavement with a regularity that timed their pulses to its beat. The darkness thickened, the air grew oppressive with a salty tang, half scent, half flavor, the subtle essence of newly spilled blood. There were whisperings about them, inarticulate chuckles, grotesque cacklings, and cold blasts of wind passed over them with the beat of invisible wings. Suddenly eyes appeared in the darkness. They glowed weirdly, green and crimson, moved about them at various heights, and finally settled in two immovable rows, baleful and hypnotic. More ghoulish chuckling and laughter, and the eyes began to whirl. Finally, with an animal chorus of gnashing of teeth, scraping of claws, and fearful howls, silence came to the chamber. If we could work anything like that in the States, whispered Morse in English, we'd have the Psychological Research Society at our feet. They've been working at it for thousands of years, replied Laidlaw. Damned effective. The dark slowly became less intense, the air laden with the delicate fragrance of spring blossoms. Black turned into purple, and purple became grey, and finally they could see the walls in front of them dissolving in whirls of mist. Upon a couch lay the exquisite form of a sleeping woman, rounded breasts lifting with her gentle breathing, skin rosy with youth and health. As they gazed, a subtle change occurred. The curves lost their roundness, the flesh shriveled and became blue, the air grew rank with the smell of death. Before their eyes the infinitely fair creature was falling away, disintegrating. The face became a skull as the flesh withered. The hair, bleached white, fell out in huge chunks, ribs and pelvis bones stood out in horrible distinction, the chamber reeked with the stench of a house. The bones fell away and crumbled, leaving only a little pile of dust from which a snake writhed away. The wall resumed shape behind the grey veil, and a dazzling light enveloped them. From its center a voice sounded. The eye of Minos witnesses and approves. Behind them another took up the ritual. It is recorded. Turn and enter. A narrow opening appeared to their vision. They crossed the threshold and a door clanged violently behind them. The room was filled with a tremulous blue radiance. At the farther end stood a statue of a woman wearing a helmet crested with the new moon. Hands were raised above its finely carved head, a twisted snake in each. About the statue's body was entwined the scaly coils of an enormous serpent, with its head resting upon the shoulder. Dull eyes gleamed like uncut emeralds. A sound of chanting came from beyond the walls. To thee, all-shining one goddess divine. Unto thy votaries vouchsafe a sign. Let thy snakes twining show us thou livest, show us that Pasiphae still mercy givest, shine on thy votaries goddess benign. Serpents, said Morse, a question in his voice. Pasiphae in her Chthonian representation as goddess of the underworld, came the reply. The light brightened with a brilliance that came in waves like the rays of the aurora borealis. In its shimmer the carven snake seemed to quiver and the eyes of the great serpent grew brighter. Look out, Laidlaw, cried Morse suddenly. The brute's alive. The head of the Ophidian raised from the shoulder of the statue and disappeared, to glide out from beneath the arm in a swift undulation, its jaws open, its tongue vibrating. A whisper of movement was heard as scales scraped over pavement. The blood of the initiates ran cold as they waited for the reptile's attack. The obscene slithering was the only sound to be heard in the chamber, and they could only guess at its position. Are you? Snarled Morse. Laidlaw kept silent. He had thought from the first glance that the snake was alive, but he believed it had been coiled about the statue in a sluggish state of coma. There was no question of its identity. More than 30 feet in length, it was the most powerful and ill-tempered of all the big serpents, the anaconda. Suddenly Morse felt a coil encircle his lower leg in a lightning loop and mount to the thigh, compressing it until it seemed that the bone must break. He set his hands on the writhing, clammy body, trying to reach the head, but encountered only a continually thickening coil. He let out an exclamation and it was echoed by Laidlaw. The anaconda had attacked both Americans at the same time, using Morse as a support on which to base the leverage of its constriction. The firm, unyielding body of the snake offered no hold. The coil about Morse's waist was as thick as his thigh, hard as a hempen cable, resistless, inexorable. His case was desperate, and both men were without weapons. A choking cry came from Laidlaw as Morse strove again to loosen the deadly twist that was slowly squeezing his leg into jelly, at the same time holding him powerless from moving. Laidlaw, he cried. The choking sound changed to a great sob of relief. Ah, sounded Laidlaw, strength emanating from his voice. I've got him. He had me about the waist. Now then. The long length of the snake whipped into wild action. Morse was thrown violently to the ground, and he felt Laidlaw close beside him. Between them, the infuriated reptile writhed and thrashed, dragging them over the hard stone floor. Laidlaw's breath came in great gasps as he exerted all his strength. Morse felt the coil about his thigh relax, and dragged at it until he freed himself. He tried to rise, but his leg refused to carry his weight. He half crawled toward Laidlaw. How can I help you? He cried. A grunt answered him. The snake's body lay across that of his friend, writhing more and more feebly. Laidlaw rolled over on top of it. I've choked the hellish thing, he gasped. I think it's dead, but I don't dare let go of it. A series of dull thuds came to their ears from outside the chamber. The chanting was taken up again. Hear us, O shining one, grant our desire. Pasiphae. Pasiphae. Dread we thy ire one to the other, O bountiful mother, accept the gifts we bring as at thy feet we cling. Pasiphae. Pasiphae. All shining one. I think we were intended to be the gifts, said Laidlaw. That could well have been our funeral ode. The flickering radiance was gradually returning, and Morse, now with his own weight on the lower half of the anaconda, saw Laidlaw battering its head, already a shapeless bloody stump, against the stone floor. One loose coil was about his middle, and Morse tugged until it came limply away. The two sat up and looked at each other as Laidlaw flung away the battered head, and Morse kicked at the convulsively twitching mass with his sound leg while he tried to rub the other back to sensibility. Cheerful little trick, he said angrily. The snake of the goddess resenting the intrusion of strangers. That would have been the verdict, I suppose. Are you full of regrets and the snake full of us? Ah! How did you manage to get hold of its neck? Good luck! The devil has ruined my digestion forever, though. Morse started to laugh, and Laidlaw found himself echoing him. In the reaction to their danger, they laughed half hysterically until they could force themselves to their feet. The scientist rubbed his stomach. My diaphragm is gelid. How's your leg? Morse prodded it and winced. It's sound, but it's sore as the devil. Well, if you planned this, said Laidlaw, he did a good job. He had an alibi ready. The mystic voice broke into the chamber. Advance, O neophytes. A section of the wall slid downward and they passed through the opening into natural light, leaving the dying snake behind. At a junction of the low corridor, a grey and shapeless figure with a skull mask stood beckoning to them. Had this proved to be R.U., Morse felt that he could have done away with him then and there. But the voice of this sentinel quickly betrayed the presence as Chiron. The Misty to the right, he said, your test has ended. Yours, Apopti, to the left, adding in a lower tone, and courage, brother, even in darkness. Laidlaw held back a moment, but Morse urged him on. If they plan to do us harm we can't escape it, he said, and took the left-hand passage. It ended almost before it had begun in another gloomy chamber that grew totally dark when the door closed behind his entrance. A voice like that of a ventriloquist, its source indeterminate, accosted him. Now comes the final choice, Apopti. Perhaps it lies with you. Who knows? Perhaps the gods direct. Yet it is on your action that the issue hangs. Gaze and ponder before your body answers to your settled will. With a clang, a door slid back, and a gush of heat surged into the room. A fire glared in a passage beyond the door, pulsing with swift plays of molten orange and vermilion. The portal closed, and a second door revealed 4 leaping, manellis cat creatures. Large as full-grown lions, they were skin-clad in ebony velvet, with topaz eyes, crimson mouths, and sabered ivory fangs. The beasts sprang at him and roared in frenzy as a barred gate rose up before them. A third exit lifted, and a breath of night air, mingled with flower perfume and the clean smell of the lake, stole into his nostrils. The way lay open up a slight incline to a point where silver moonlight bathed an open causeway. As this was shut out, the voice came to him. Commend the prompting of your will unto the gods. As they judge you, so shall you go scatheless or to your doom. The floor beneath him started to revolve slowly, not enough to disturb his balance, but acquiring speed enough to wipe out any lingering idea he might hold of the location of the respective doors. Morse had entered the ordeal in the belief that the initiation was calculated to break the nerves of a superstitious man. The fight with the snake had disturbed his confidence, but his wrath, somewhat calmed by Chiron's friendly message, was still dominant enough to wish to put a swift end to what he still believed to be a combination of masquerade and optical illusion. Without hesitation, he moved to the wall. One hand encountered a projection, the other, sliding over the vertical surface, passed from coolness to heat, slight but distinctly noticeable. He moved along the contour of the chamber until he felt a second knob, and bent, listening intently. Did he hear the faint sound of muffled growls? Morse wondered if the tests might hold real quality. Swiftly he sought the third latch, found it, clutched and pulled. It resisted, but then slid readily before a side thrust. Before him rose the incline to the moonlit causeway, and pure air met him as he ran up the rise. Gulping the sweet air into his lungs, he reached the causeway. Behind him the egress had closed, and the carven facade of the temple showed in grey and purple silence. Morse crossed the causeway to a balustrade and leaned upon it. The crescent moon faintly outlined the temple on the Isle of Sele. Here was the realm of Leola, sister of Rana, and her Diane. A breeze blew off the lake, and suddenly Morse wondered if this beautiful Leola could hold any of the magical enchantment that her island did, there in the moonlight. Below him, a galley with oars supplementing a silvered sail reached silently for a wharf. He straightened from his thoughts, his arms folded on the wide baluster rail, then turned reluctantly to move away. A soft, thudding rush of feet sounded behind him. A cloth was thrown over his head, and the gathered folds pinned his arms to his sides. Morse fought against the arms that sought to hold him and lift him from his feet. Coarse oaths came to his ears, sounding dimly through the muffling linen. Then, still struggling, he was lifted from his feet and borne away. A voice rang out. It was high-pitched and as sweetly clear as the sound of a silver trumpet. His captors paused and set him down. "Who are you who dare to profane the bridal night of Pasiphae? Stand, before I turn you into stone." Morse heard the mumbling apologies of the men who had attacked him. The cloth was hastily removed, and he faced his rescuer. It was a woman. She was slender and tall, clothed in garments that glittered, one arm raised forcibly. There was something strangely familiar about her face. It was clean-carven, imperious, set like a flower upon a neck that was as round and smooth as a column. Hair, piled high, glinted pale gold in the moonlight. 2 eyes burned like azure stars. The woman stood on the causeway. Behind her were a score of her fair sex, clad in white garments with ornaments that gleamed as they moved. "Who are you?" she asked. "And why does this rabble molest you?" The men who had seized him slunk away as Morse answered. "I am one of the strangers to Atlantis." And as he spoke he knew that this was Leola. Her likeness to Rana could not be mistaken. But here was a refinement of feature, a majesty that the queen could not approach. "I have no idea who these are who have attacked me," he continued, "though I might make a guess. The night has not been altogether fortunate for me until now." She surveyed him with a disdain that was tempered by a half-concealed curiosity. "You are the one who conquered Aulus," she said, "and tonight you became an Epopti. Are you so enamored of Atlantis that you would forsake your own land?" "I have never been enamored until this moment," he answered truthfully, his eyes upon hers. Did her eyes waver? "Your words are idle," she said. "Yet I would thank you for my rescue." "I would not willingly see even a man harmed," came the reply. "Even a man?" Morse repeated the words out loud and smiled. "Still I thank you. And I thank the gods, Leola, that I am a man and that you are a woman." Again her eyes seemed to waver. "I do not read the meaning of your words," she said, and some of her assurance was gone. "They are not hard to understand," he answered. "But the key lies not in the mind, but in the heart." A knot of men was hurrying toward them, and a voice called his name. It was Laidlaw. "Here are my friends," said Morse. "Again I thank you, Leola. We will meet again." She made no answer save for an uptilt of that haughty head, and stepped backward, still facing him, until her women surrounded her. Only then did Morse turn to greet his friends. "Lola," he said, just above his breath, testing the liquid syllables. La. The name fits her. It is like the murmur of moonlit ripples upon a silver beach. Chapter 10. The Isle of Sele. Chiron came in upon the two Americans the next morning shortly after their plunge. The automatic pistols and belts lay upon the low couch, and he picked up one of them. "You expect trouble?" he asked seriously. "We are going to start it, Chiron," answered Morse. "Start it at the first hint that the other fellow is even thinking about it." He buckled the belt about his waist. "After this, Laidlaw and I are going to feel a lot safer with these handy, and I'd appreciate it if you would send Maya and Kolo to us for some additional support. I've had enough of this sort of thing." He exposed his leg, deep purple and yellow where the anaconda had crushed it. "My middle's in the same shape," said Laidlaw. "Hereafter I've got a special grudge against snakes, including a certain two-legged one." Chiron looked puzzled, and Morse related what had happened in the shrine of Pasiphae and the attempt to capture him afterward. "There is no snake about the middle of the statue," said the king. "It must have been placed there to destroy you." He mused thoughtfully. "You might have said that the snake appeared to resist the profanation of the shrine by strangers. But since you passed the ordeal successfully, you have some measure of protection. I don't think you will be attacked on the street, though I will send your Indians to you. There are strange things working in Atlantis. Unseen politics, disaffection among the soldiers. With no outer enemies to fear, our military is recruited for police duty, though every noble keeps up the practice of arms. You and the priests control a force of Indians who have been well trained. It is plain they constitute a menace. There has been grumbling over taxes, which are light enough, and a disposition to break through old rules regarding nobility. Almost all the elements of rebellion are slowly fermenting. But these are not your troubles," he added. "I should not burden you with them. I came to ask you to breakfast with me." "My stomach is in sad condition," grinned Laidlaw, "but this is a good chance to test it. And one should never discuss politics on an empty stomach." As they ate, Chiron outlined the festivities of the month of Pasiphae. It was the month of planting, the wedding of seeds with the earth, an occasion in which the priestesses of the moon goddess took a prominent part. Many gifts were thrown into the lake to propitiate the god that dwelt beneath the water, and these Chiron expected to be unusually valuable and numerous owing to the gradually increasing warmth of the water. The festivals would end with a joint service in worship of the double-axe deities. "Not too many years ago the priests used to sacrifice maidens to Minos," said Chiron, "and youths to Pasiphae. But this custom is no longer practiced, for which I am thankful. Ru resents this loss and loses no opportunity to prophesy trouble in consequence. But the people are tired of innocent blood being spilled." "By the way, Morse," asked Chiron, "did Leola speak to you?" Morse felt his face grow hot. Even as Chiron had been speaking, his mind had been wandering to thoughts of this priestess. He had dreamt of her through the night, and he pondered a little that she had so filled his thoughts. At the same moment Chiron had questioned him, Morse was wondering if he had fallen in love. "Yes," he answered, still embarrassed. "She did speak to me. As a matter of fact, she referred to me as even a man, as if she was issuing an order to her followers not to tread on worms." "That's the way she feels about us," laughed Chiron. "I have a grudge against her myself. She won over the girl who was learning to return my love. Now she is Leola's first priestess." "Who is she?" asked Laidlaw. "Lycidas," returned the king. "A beautiful creature. And far more human than Leola. We'll see a good deal of both of them in the next day or so. If I were you," he looked warningly at Morse, "I wouldn't let Rana catch you looking in the direction of her younger sister. She's loved her a lot more since Leola took her stand against men and went off to Sele." Rana welcomed Morse to the stand erected for the royal court upon the palace steps. She did not even acknowledge Laidlaw. Morse managed to conceal his limp, not caring to discuss its origin with her in front of Ru, who inquired after his health with a placid assurance of friendship. After the festival, whispered Rana, she had a trick of making the most trivial utterances sound confidential. I have planned an entertainment at my villa at the southern end of the lake. Nidus, the poet, has written a drama, The End of Eros, he calls it, that is a satire on our affairs. And we are all going to take part in it. You and Chiron may go hunting the cave beast while we rehearse if you promise not to get hurt. Upon leaned toward him languorously, her breath upon his cheek, her bare arm, soft as satin, lightly touching the length of his. Morse felt unusually irritant. His leg throbbed, and he had much the same feeling that a bird has when its feet first stick to a line twig. He answered shortly, and Rana drew back, half offended. You are ill-tempered this morning, she said. One would think you were your friend over there. Look at that sulky brute. Morse could not retain his smile as he glanced at Laidlaw, who was not in the least sulky. That's better, breathed Rana. I had almost begun to hate you. She shot him a glance that held more than a hint of temper. Morse remembered his promise to Laidlaw and spurred himself to lighter talk, wondering in the meantime how he could escape the threatened visit to the villa. The morning was magnificent. At the far end of the lake, 25 miles away, the crater was outlined in sharp relief. The water was a deep sapphire. Here and there boats carrying large numbers of spectators came on under sail and oar, straddling like giant water bugs. A ceremonial barge from Sele was midway to the shore, and the sweet voices of the priestesses came faintly to them. The causeway that bordered the lake was strewn ankle-deep with flowers, and water-bearers passed along refreshing them so that they might render their full fragrance as they were crushed beneath the feet of the procession. A blare of trumpets came from the temple steps, and a company of priests in gleaming golden robes made their way to the landing to greet the priestesses of Pasiphae. Ru, after making his courtesies, had disappeared from the royal box. The route was lined with spectators of all ages, and shifting colors from their bright-hued garments gave the effect of a flower garden in a breeze. Behind the palace the volcano cast its morning shadow across that quarter of Atlantis, and a fume of vapor issued from its snow cap in irregular puffs. Silence fell as the spectators craned their necks. A long fanfare of trumpets ended, and the sound of chanting became more and more pronounced. The procession had started. First to appear were a company of children, some of whom sang in shrill, sweet voices. Others played a simple tune upon a double pipe. Older youths and maidens followed, leading with garlands a snow-white bull with gilded horns and hoofs, a wreath about its massive neck, all that remained of the grisly minotaur worship once found in ancient Crete. The priest's guard was headed by a giant Indian, of that strange race who were long servitors to the Atlanteans. Clad in jaguar skins, a crested helmet, and with a chain of gold upon his great chest, he glanced insolently about him. Forewarned by Chiron's talk at breakfast, Morse detected an arrogance, a swagger, dominating the entire bodyguard, and he believed that rebellion was contained here only by the prospect of license to come. Ru rode in their center in an open litter, his head shaded by a heavily fringed canopy held by 4 slaves. Behind him marched a column of priests, carrying for a standard the emblem of the double axe. More of the Indian bodyguard appeared, with sullen jaguars held in check by short bronze chains. The front ranks of the spectators shrank back until a body of gladiators paraded before them. Among them was Aulus, who cast a malevolent glare at Morse as he passed. Athletes of both sexes walked with the bulls of the arena. A break in the procession was closed by maidens strewing white-petaled, fresh flowers, and others carrying wicker cages from which they released white doves, emblems of Pasiphae. The Americans had an unpleasant reminder as a dozen girls marched by with serpents twining about their arms and throats and white bodies. But these snakes were boars, none over 10 feet in length, and mild-dispositioned pets of the temple. 100 priestesses, dark hair bound with fillets of silver to uphold a crescent moon disk, sleeveless garments shot with the same metal, swung by disdainfully, chanting as they went. Morse barely noticed them, waiting for the approach of the high priestess. He sat erect, his face alight, his eagerness unconcealed. Rana leaned back, watching him intently, as if suddenly suspicious of his interest. Chiron, too, was now alert, shaken from the usual blasé pose which he wore in public. She came at last, abreast with 2 other litters of ivory on which her lieutenants reclined. Above them were silken awnings of azure, studded with silver stars. A single priestess dared a swift, shy glance at the court, then turned away as Chiron stirred in his seat. Leola lay indifferent to the crowd, her face as serene as the full moon, the exquisite outline of her form revealed by her clinging drapery. One bare, rounded arm lay so that the taper fingers drooped over the edge of the litter, one arched, silver-sandaled foot peeping from the brocaded hem of her robe. There was confusion among the gladiators. 2 of the bulls were out of control, and the procession halted. Irresistibly attracted, Morse gazed at Leola, his heart in his eyes. Slowly under his gaze the high priestess turned her head toward him as golden poppies turn toward the sun. The white lids, he could trace the tiny blue veins upon them, lifted, and her dark eyes looked into his. An invisible bridge was formed. Morse felt his spirit stealing out upon it, and knew that Hes had come to meet it. A rosy blush transfused her face, the blush spreading to her neck and flooding the ivory of her army to the fingertips, like Pygmalion's marble Galatea slowly coming to life under the sculptor's compelling love. Trumpets sounded and the procession resumed its march. Leola's litter passed. The connection established by their glances snapped as an electric current dies with the turn of a switch, and Morse gave an involuntary sigh that released the breath he had been holding in. Beside him, he became suddenly conscious of Rana's presence. He turned. The queen's face was sphinx-like, and the spots of rouge she affected stood out against her pallor like crimson bruises. Her eyes were as hard and glittering as those of the anaconda at the shrine. So, she spoke slowly, picking her words, you and my sister seem attracted by each other. It is strange, indeed, for she has disavowed men both by preference and by oath. She may change one, but do not tempt her to break the other. It would mean death for both of you unless. She stopped speaking, her hands shaking like a wintry leaf, her voice trembling. You have seen her before, she almost hissed. Morse answered her quietly, wondering at his own calmness. She rescued me last night when some of your Atlantean cutthroats set upon me. I suspect I have her to thank for my life. Ah! Rana relaxed, and some of the cruelty left her eyes, though suspicions still lurked in their depths. Who were these men? They came at me swiftly, he replied, and later they slunk quietly into the shadows. They were Indians, but not slaves. They wore swords. Rana's brows met, and she compressed her lips. They shall be punished, she said aloud, and to herself, and you, my sister, shall be watched. The court rose after the procession had passed, making their way, first by litter and then by boats, to a great float roofed with silken curtains. Here they feasted and watched the ceremony of propitiation. Ayu and his priests descended the water stairs of the temple, and as the men chanted, cast objects into the water that glittered as they whirled and shot out colored sparks from the gems that encrusted them. Then they ranged themselves on either side, as Leola and her attendants repeated the action. The populace lined the balustrade, waiting for a signal for their share in the sacrifice. It came with a blast of trumpets, and a shower of ornaments rained into the lake. The trumpets were repeated, and at each blast gold and gems broke the water's surface. Chiron tossed in a miniature replica of the double axe, but Morse noticed that the nobles cast their share not over-liberally. It is all a great waste, said Rana, as she slipped a magnificent bracelet from her wrist. Still, it satisfies the people and keeps the artificers busy. You, too, must sacrifice, now that you are a noble of Atlantis. I have nothing valuable but what you have given me, said Morse. He spoke as a matter of fact, but Rana smiled and laid her hand upon his arm with a lingering pressure. That was a courtier's speech, she said. Give me that fibula. He took the golden ornament that was strangely like an elaborate safety pin from his mantle and handed it to her. She plucked a silver cord from the fringe of her rainbow-plaided girdle and tied the pin to her bracelet, then turned and tossed the two offerings into the air together. The knot slipped, and the offerings fell apart before they reached the water. There was an involuntary silence among the nobles, and Chiron smiled. Rana shot him a murderous look, her face distorted like that of Medusa. Poseidon refuses your combination, cousin, mocked Chiron. The omens are not favorable. I hate you, she hissed. Chiron only laughed, and Rana bent an inscrutable look upon Morse. There was tragedy here, an apprehension, and a purpose that he could not quite understand. The ceremonial is over, she said abruptly. It is useless to wait longer. Let us return to the palace. She rose petulantly, summoning the boats, but she did not ask him to join her for the return. With open relief, Morse took a seat beside Laidlaw. The conclusion of the ritual was a signal for the crowd to depart. This was done in a confusion of oars and sails that produced much laughter and shouting. Somehow, a lane was cleared for the ceremonial barge of the High Priestess of Pasiphae, a cumbersome, top-heavy craft with a shrine built high upon its stern. It was towed by ropes from two galleys, rowed by lesser priestesses and neophytes. A sudden wind blew from the cliffs and sent the cluster of boats into a hopeless entanglement. Laughter was replaced by cries of consternation. Morse saw that the royal float had been torn from its moorings, and, impelled by the strong wind upon its awnings and curtains, it bore down on the overladen boats. The float was high out of water, and heavily built. It was a formidable engine of destruction as it drove before the fury of this sudden gale. Women and children screamed, and men fought hard to clear their boats from its path. It smashed into an open shallop, driving the craft beneath the water as its occupants were dragged aboard a larger vessel. A second float was destroyed, and the float now threatened the barge of the priestesses. The oarswomen towing the barge faltered in their stroke, undecided as to a course of action. Morse, recognizing the frail construction of the barge, urged his rowers forward. In the face of imminent danger, Leola remained calm, but below her women huddled together in fear. The heavy float crashed into the stern of the barge, and the shrine, insecurely attached, first rocked and then toppled into the water amid the shrieks of the onlookers. Leola moved suddenly as the platform tottered, springing to clear herself. As she reached the water, weighted down as she was by her heavy, silvered robes and ritual ornaments, she fought to swim away from the wreck, but the supports of the silken awning struck her and she sank below the surface. A score of boats raced to the rescue of the High Priestess, and the one which carried Morse and Laidlaw was as close as any. Morse flung off his outer garment and dived into the water. An oar struck him a glancing blow on the side of his head as he leaped, but it did not deter him. He surfaced, wiped the mingled blood and water from his eyes, and sought his direction. The blue and silver awning floated 30 feet away, and there beyond it he made out a gleam of silver tissue and the clutching fingers of a hand that barely showed above the surface, then disappeared. Morse pushed himself through the water with frantic strokes, and, nearing the point where he had glimpsed the hand, he dove. Below him he saw a confused mass of garments outspread in the current, and streaming from them a mass of golden hair. He reached for the hair, seized it finally, and struggled upward. His lungs seemed about to burst before he broke the surface into the world of bright sunlight. For half a minute there was silence about him, and then a roar of excited cheers. Morse turned on his back, paddling with his legs and one hand, letting go of the girl's hair and managing to throw his free arm about her shoulders. Leola's body, heavy with the soaked robes, dragged down, but her head was securely on his shoulder. Her face, pale as the petals of a water lily, dark eyes closed, lay turned toward his chest. Laidlaw suddenly loomed above the couple, anchored squarely in the stern of the boat. A moment later, his powerful arms gathered in the limp form of Leola, and Morse was pulled over the side by 2 oarsmen. "Row to the float," Morse ordered gaspingly, as he fought for his breath. The sudden gale was over, and the big platform that had caused the damage had been secured. Now it swung on its broken cable, held by men in boats who had come up too late for the rescue. Morse stepped onto the float and took Leola from Laidlaw's arms, laying her gently on the rugs and cushions that had been provided for the royal party. He knelt over her. There were no visible bruises. The support had struck the mass of her hair, tearing it from its combs and fastenings, but the thick pad of it had caused the blow to stun and not injure her. And her insensibility had prevented her from swallowing a dangerous amount of water. As Morse knelt down, the blood from his scalp wound dropped upon her robe. He gently raised the ivory arms above her head and lowered them again to promote respiration. After a dozen motions, he was rewarded by a quiver of her eyelids and the slow, perceptible heave of her breast. Someone handed him a crystal flask, and he dropped a little of the pungent liquid between her slightly parted lips that disclosed the even, pearly teeth. Her eyes opened and gazed into his, blankly at first, before the light suddenly shone in them. She sighed. Morse thought he distinguished some syllables and bent lower. He was not mistaken. It was his name that she murmured for a second time, not the harsh surname, but his first name, softened by the Greek tongue to Stanley. Then her eyes closed as he whispered her name in return. A faint tinge of rose appeared in her cheeks. A group of protesting priestesses surrounded them. 2 of them knelt, and Morse remembered one as the girl who had glanced up at Chiron from her litter. She pillowed Leola's head upon her lap and attempted to make her comfortable. Morse was surprised at the angry voices and glances that he drew, and allowed Laidlaw to draw him to one side where Chiron spoke to him. "Come into my boat, both of you. You have done all you can, at least, all they'll let you do." The barge had sunk. The priestesses had been taken in by the boats that had towed them, and they were now on the float seeking to shield their high priestess from the gaze of men. "They seem to be angry that you saved her life," said Laidlaw, helping Morse bind a strip of linen about his head. Chiron chuckled. "They are," he said. "You have profaned the person of Pasiphae's representative. They will have to hold votive ceremonies for a month to wipe out the ignominy of the touch of a man. I wish I'd had your chance, though," he added ruefully. "With Leola?" asked Laidlaw. "Not with Leola," admitted the king. And he went on, "Rana looks furious. I watched her during the rescue and I think she sensed your anxiety. If I were you, I'd make that wound of yours an excuse for staying away from the banquet tonight. Otherwise the praise that you are bound to receive from those who do not share the priestess's view of profanation is going to provoke Rana into a display of temper. You're not hurt, are you?" "Nothing but a scrape," replied Morse. "Sorry if I called down the wrath of Pasiphae." But he did not look very unhappy as he said it, and Chiron rallied him. "Leola didn't raise any objection when she revived," he said with a smile. Morse grinned in reply. "I'll send my excuses to Rana. Laidlaw, will you take them?" Laidlaw grunted. "You need a nurse," he said. Later, an hour after Laidlaw had departed for the banquet, Morse rose suddenly from the lounge on which he had been lying. Strange thoughts had been running through his mind, thoughts of Leola. Since their meeting, his nature seemed to have changed, developed into a condition that left him feverish and uncertain. He had never been in love, he avoided it, he had exposed himself little to its conditions. Occasionally, when he was in New York after wanderings in little-known lands, he would find it necessary to attend some elaborate function of relatives or family friends. But here he would remain the silent, almost unseen guest, lurking in some out-of-the-way corner and dreaming of his next exploration, much to the chagrin of many of the women whose main objective seemed to be seeing Stanley married and securely tied down. Morse knew that he was not cut out for such a life, that he was out of place in the society that bred him. But in Sele, priestess of Pasiphae, there was much to lure him. Sele, mentally alert, throwing out a challenge to men that, failing her standard, she would have none of, blessed with a beauty that was flawlessly alien to the women he knew, possessing an element of the very mystery that drew him irresistibly, time and again, to the unexplored and unknown. Leola. From the first moment of meeting he had sensed the magic, the electricity between them. Now he knew what he had not seen before, hidden as it had been by this new feeling, that Leola must become his mate, jungle or civilization, it made no difference. And he knew, too, that he had pierced the armor of her reserve. Her eyes, the flush on her cheeks, the murmur of his name upon her lips, they told him. But Morse did not blind himself. Rana was jealous. Leola was a priestess with vows that excluded men from her life. Love for him would expose her to a scorn, perhaps more, from the priestesses of Sele, and perhaps the virulence of Ru. Yet, if she loved him, his soul kindled at the thought. He loved her. She was the mystery that he had sought unknowingly over all the world. He would win her. And Chiron would aid him. The king, beneath his practiced indifference, was a man, and he hid a passion for another priestess of that woman's isle. They would flee Atlantis, its intrigues and threat of revolution. Morse's thoughts could not wait. Before him was a night of freedom. Unseen, he could slip across to the Isle of Sele, forbidden though it was to men, and confront Leola in the very shrine of Pasiphae, if that were necessary. He dressed himself with scrupulous care and lingered before the metal mirror in a fashion that would have been laughable to the Morse of a day before. It had been only 24 hours since he had first seen her. Since then she had looked at him with eyes that hinted at understanding and spoken with lips that had betrayed her. He called Maya and Kolo and cautioned them to tell any inquirers that he was asleep, that he could not be disturbed. These bronzed watchmen could be relied upon in case a message came from Rana. Then he slipped away toward the water stairs. The night was brilliant, the deserted causeway illuminated by moon and stars. The nobles were at the palace fete, the populace, tired with the day's excitement, in their homes. Chiron had given him the key to a bronze lock that chained a light boat, and Morse stepped into it. He took up the strange, square-bladed oars and rowed the shallop swiftly from the shore, sending wavelets back along the calm surface. As the boat left the landing, two forms, clad in the tawny kilts of the priest's guard, rose from the shadow and slipped away in the direction of the palace. Morse turned his head and saw the Isle of Sele, its temple columns white beneath the moon. A bluish ray, made more conspicuous by the smoke that curled in the spreading shaft of light, lifted from behind the pillars. The lake was destitute of other craft, and an almost invisible mist hung over it in patches. Morse ran his hand through the water and was startled at the temperature. It had been warm when he rescued Leola, but now it seemed to be almost the temperature of blood. As he approached the island, the sound of singing came to his ears. It was the chant of women's voices in a simple, pleasing harmony carried to him on the breeze. He faced the city, grey against the background of trees and cliff. The snowy cone of the volcano appeared silver, and from it came great puffs of cloud, purple-bodied, laced at the edges by the moonlight. Morse noticed that they were on the increase from the morning. Soon he was in the shadow of the isle. The water was deep close up to the steep and rocky shore, which was thickly set with tall trees and a profusion of palms and semi-tropical undergrowth. Flowers grew everywhere on the ground amid the shrubbery, in the treetops, and between them the vivid blossoms of orchids swung free, hanging from branches or trailing along the lianas. Morse avoided the main landing, and paddled along easily, looking for a place to step ashore. The chanting came faintly through the trees, and above them the blue, vaporous ray showed ominously. He was aware of the danger of being discovered on the sacred island, and remembered the anger of the priestesses after his rescue of Leola. These women were trained in the use of arms, Chiron had said, and boasted of their ability to equal man in all athletic pursuits. Morse was inclined to believe in their capability. Yet, he reflected, they had screamed and shown signs of indecision in their alarm at the float. Perhaps they were unable to banish all feminine attributes. A long, narrow cove appeared, and he headed into it silently. At its extreme the surface was covered with enormous circular leaves, the size of a tabletop, among which floated huge, pink water lilies. Morse stepped ashore to a velvety turf, secured the boat, and moved through a wood in the direction of the singing. The trees were thick, and it took him a long time to make his way through the dense underbrush in the extreme darkness. Finally he broke through, and only by gripping some stout creepers did he hold himself back from a fall that would have meant instant discovery. Morse had reached the rim of a grassy bowl that sloped before him in a sharp incline toward an oval of level ground at its center. The grass in the bowl was starred with gorgeous, night-blooming flowers. At one end of the oval 12 exquisitely carved columns were set in a circle. They were unroofed and unconnected and fashioned so skillfully and elaborately that they seemed to be shafts of magical growth, rather than pillars of solid stone. In the center of their circle stood an altar upon which burned the flame that formed the blue ray. 2 priestesses stood beside it, one pouring oil occasionally into the reservoir that fed the flame, while the other from time to time cast into it a powder that produced the color and gave out a resinous pungent perfume. In the open space before the shrine, a figure, clad only in a diaphanous robe, postured within a group of priestesses who lay motionless on the ground, their vestments covering them in filmy folds. Surrounding them in double ranks were the singers, waving long branches of palm in rhythm to their chant. The sound of strings and notes of piping arose from somewhere in their midst. Brilliant moonlight illumined the scene almost as vividly as by day, yet invested it with a mystery that caused it to seem unreal, the vision of a dream. Crouched in the thicket, his gaze fixed on the center figure whose limbs moved with exquisite grace, Morse listened to the words of the song. Mother of life and love, thou the all-giving shine on us from above our faults forgiving. Thou who divinest all our desires, note, as thou shinest, thy altar fires. Virgin and cold as we, in emulation strive we to copy thee with adoration. Thy beams, descending, enter our hearts, pour prayers ascending mount on our darts. Hear us, O Pasiphae being divine. Smile on us, Pasiphae shine, goddess, shine. The chant ended, and the prostrate votaries arose. With arms aloft, they wove in and out the measures of a stately dance about their high priestess who stood in an attitude of appeal. Her arms were extended to the moon, its beams full upon her face, subduing the pale gold of her hair to frosted silver. Faster and faster moved the dancers, their garments streaming with the pace until they formed a continuous, swiftly moving chain of shimmering silk, lowering their arms to shoulder level and linking fingers, while their naked feet seemed hardly to touch the ground. The motion was reversed, the steps slackened, and the chain broke into separate links, each with a silent, motionless figure of supplication. The palm branches were raised moonward. The altar attendants left their fire and advanced toward Leola. From one of them she took a bow, and from the other 4 arrows. Impaled upon the latter, close to the points, were strips of papyrus. Leola bent the bow, and the first shaft sped upward, glittering as it curved in a graceful arc to fall beyond the rim of the basin among the trees. The high priestess turned as she loosed one of the prayer-bearing messengers to each quarter of the heavens. The last arrow dropped within a few feet of Morse, its head buried in the turf. He reached out cautiously, secured it, and placed it within the folds of his chiton. The altar fire was dying down. The singers and musicians had formed ranks and marched toward a path that led through the forest to their temple. The dancers followed. Only Leola remained. When the oval was deserted, she moved slowly toward the shrine and knelt beside the altar. The flame fluttered and vanished. The high priestess regained her feet, passed her hands across her brows, then raised them toward the moon. Morse caught the sound of a faint sigh. The procession had disappeared. The words of the chant to which they marched were scarcely audible. Smile on us, Pasiphae. Shine, goddess, shine. He cupped his hands and called softly but distinctly. Lole. The high priestess started, set a swift hand to her heart, and looked toward him as he repeated her name. He stepped free of the thicket and advanced down the slope toward the shrine. She came toward him, her arms motioning him away. Go back, she cried. You must not be seen here. It means death. Go back. Morse's heart gave a sudden leap. She did not want him discovered. She wanted to shield him, high priestess though she was. I will not go back unless you come with me, he said simply. With you where? She answered, a little wildly. To the edge of the forest, where your last arrow fell at my feet. Where my last arrow fell, she repeated slowly, a strange look of awe upon her face. Yes, he insisted. Come. He held out his hand, and she slipped her cool fingers into it unresistingly. Instantly he thrilled to her touch, and knew that she shared the emotion. At the fringe of the thicket she paused and attempted to withdraw her hand. I must not, I will not, she cried. What magic have you wrought on me, O stranger? Not a stranger, but Stanley, he said. The moonlight could not efface the rosy color that stole into her face. As for the magic, it was not I who used it, it was you, Leola. I? You. For never until now did I know for what I have been seeking. As you have lived without need of man, Leola, so did I live without need of woman until I met you. Then, as the seed breaks through the dark earth and bears a blossom, my spirit flowered. But the flower blooms only for you. You must not talk to me this way, she said. I spoke to you, I came this far with you only to repay the life you saved this afternoon. Only for that, Leola. Swear to me that it was for that reason alone, and I will believe you and go. He forced her to meet his gaze. You are not kind, she murmured. Listen, said Morse. I heard the words of the chant to Pasiphae. She drew back with a gleam of anger in her eyes. You dared. I dared, he answered quietly. And you know why I dared, Leola. It was not to witness forbidden rites. But I heard the last of the singing. You asked the moon goddess to receive the prayers impaled upon your darts. You believe that she can answer them. Surely. He took the arrow from his robe and read the linear script inscribed upon the papyrus. Grant, O Pasiphae, the dearest wish of our hearts. It fell at my feet, he said. Your hand guided its upward flight, but surely the goddess directed its descent. Am I not the answer? He had dared a great deal, and resentment flamed in her glance. Then it softened. I do not know why I stay here talking with you, she said. My vows. The moonlight faded. Clouds formed from the vapors of the volcano were being driven across the face of the planet by a breeze which was beginning to stir the tree tops in back of them. Look, said Morse. Pasiphae is mighty, but Eros conquers her and veils her face. Love has come to both of us, Leola. It spoke from our eyes as they met when the procession halted. Was it for nothing that you came ashore last night as I was being captured, for nothing that I found you in the waters of the lake and rescued you? It was the will of the gods, Leola. Fate mocks at vows, except the ones she prompts, and fate vowed you and I to each other long ago when she willed that we should meet, though half the world divided us. A heavy mass of vapor completely shrouded the moon and chased the watchful shadows. Morse placed his arms about her and drew her to him. For a moment she resisted, then suddenly accepted the embrace. Her face was lifted slowly to his, as if fighting against surrender. He set his palm against the masses of her hair and bent his lips to her. They were tremulous, but warm with life, and met his in a kiss that joined them irrevocably. Men broke through the undergrowth, seized Morse from behind, and tore Leola from his arms. Her hair caught upon a trailing vine and showered down in a rain of pale gold as the moon's disk cleared. Morse struggled in silence as more men flung themselves upon him, but Leola shook off the lighter grasp of the two that held her. "How dare you?" she gasped. "How dare you? One cry and my followers will come and slay you for your profanation." A man took a step from the band. He was bearded and dressed in priestly vestments. Morse recognized him as one of Aulus' advisors. "You have no followers, Leola," he said sternly. "It is you who have profaned your own shrine. Do you think the priestesses of Pasiphae will obey one who has forsworn her vows and brought the worship of the goddess into disrepute?" Leola was silenced. Rude hands were clapped across Morse's mouth before he could prevent it. The next moment he was trussed and helpless, and being carried to the cove where he had landed. Beside his shallop was a galley manned by slaves. He was tossed into its stern like a bundle, and the next moment Leola, also bound and gagged, was laid beside him. Morse was sick at the thought of what he had brought upon the woman he loved, and he twisted until the hide strips sank into his flesh. His arm rested against Leola's, and her fingers interlaced themselves in his with a pressure that was forgiveness perhaps love. The galley was poled out of the cove, and under lusty strokes raced toward the mainland. As Morse lay there, the wind lifted a fragrant tress of Leola's hair, and it fell across his face like a caress. He touched it with his lips. The boat glided against the landing, and the prisoners were lifted out silently and carried up the water stairs. Morse saw the cone of the volcano lifting its peak against the stars, its hoary crest gleaming frostily. The puffs of vapor had turned into an uninterrupted flow of smoke that funneled out to a dense mass, part of which streamed leeward like a dusty, pointing finger. The lower part of the cloud was tinged with a lurid, pulsating glow. Chapter 11. The Judgment of Aulus. The palace festival hall was a blaze of light as the prisoners were ushered in. Its tables were arranged in a wide U, and the diners had apparently rearranged their places in expectation of something to come. Aulus sat by the side of Rana, and back of them were ranged the priests of Minos. The guard was heavily disposed inside the door. Morse looked around, first for Chiron and then for Laidlaw, but both men were absent. Morse and Leola had been placed upon their feet outside the entrance, their lower bonds loosened in order that they might walk, and then forced into the dining hall by their captors. Rana regarded them with the eyes of a basilisk, and Aulus with more complacency but none the less assurance. "So, my sister," said Rana fiercely, "it seems that you are more human than we thought. You, the woman who styled the other sex stupid, have succumbed to the seduction of a stranger." Leola surveyed the queen calmly, as if she had not spoken, and Aulus took up the denunciation. "Priestess of Pasiphae, you are forsworn," he said, and the nobles about the tables craned their necks to listen. "The fire mountain shows the anger of the gods. The lake itself is an emblem of their growing wrath. We have consulted the oracles with anxious questionings, and they have answered." In the silence that fell upon the hall as Aulus paused, the heavy breathing of the audience betrayed their fear and superstition. Aulus looked at them with the air of an animal trainer who had been doubtful whether his performers had forgotten their tricks, but now he knew that they were held well in hand. "The oracle has said, from fire and water was Atlantis born. When fire and water mingle, then the beginning shall be the end. Watch carefully, lest destruction come from without. Desert not the gods, lest in time of peril they in turn desert you. When fire and water mingle, the lake will soon begin to boil unless the danger can be averted. Vapor hangs over it tonight, vapor born of the mingling of the elements. Watch carefully, lest destruction come from without. Within our midst, in the very center of our age-old worship of the eternal gods, Leola has been unfaithful to her vows, a priestess who has flouted the gods and made a mockery of them before their own altars." A muttering broke out along the line of tables. Rana alone said nothing, but she bent a venomous gaze upon her sister, who looked through her as if she had not been present. "From the outside have come strangers with talk of peoples who are so much more powerful than Atlantis. If they are so great and wise, why do they come to spy upon us? Why are they not content to remain in their own land as we are in Atlantis? Yet, we would have treated them courteously, but they have conspired with this recreant priestess to pollute our sacred shrines. Their penalty must be death." The mutterings grew louder, but under Ayu's piercing stare no one dared show signs of dissent. "And simple death cannot atone for, nor avert, the gathering displeasure of the gods. Sacrifice alone will appease them." A slight tremor rocked the building, and the lamps swung on the chains that supported them. Ayu's eyes blazed with triumph. "See," he cried. "The gods answer and accept." The mutterings changed to audible exclamations of awe and wonder. Into the faces of the nobles, men and women alike, crept the look that they had worn in the amphitheater. Their eyes hardened and their mouths grew cruel. There had been no human sacrifices in Atlantis for some time. It would be a rare spectacle. "The false priestess shall stand upon the spot of sacrifice while retouches with his shining finger the rays of his emblem," said Ayu. "As for the stranger, let him learn the embrace of the bull of Minos." Morse, wondering what horrors might lie in the fate decreed for Leola, dimly sensed what his own would be. He knew the ancient torture of the Minoans described in the frescoes of Knossos, where strangers were presented to the bull, shut up within the belly of a brazen image made red-hot to receive them. Doomed and without hope as he believed them, strangely, death seemed far away, unfathomable. His mind was misty, and idly, without feeling, he wondered what they would do to Laidlaw, and if the scientist had already been condemned. Dimly he heard the thrill, almost the pleasure, in the tones of the nobles as they repeated, "The bull of Minos." He turned to Leola, and her eyes held an open avowal of love before they saddened to farewell. "Forgive me," he said hoarsely. The mist was clearing from his mind as the hands of the guards took hold of him. "There is nothing to forgive," Leola answered quietly. "You have given me love, and that is more than life." "Silence, you wanton!" It was the shrill voice of Rana, cracking in its malignity and unsuppressed anger. The queen had risen, and her face was convulsed with a deadly hatred. Ayu laid a restraining hand upon her arm. Leola smiled. "Yours is a hollow victory, my sister. I win far more than I lose, and you lose what you could never have won." Rana snatched a sharp cutting dagger from the table and threw it with all her strength and fury. Hate thwarted her aim, and the blade sank into the shoulder of a guard who stood close by. Ayu motioned the captives away. There was a sudden rush of sandaled feet, and the hall was filled with the indignant priestesses of Pasiphae. Their heads were topped with crested helmets, their waists girdled with swords. Some carried long shields that covered their bodies and bore spears, while the remainder were armed with bows and arrows. They surrounded Leola, the feathered shafts threatening Rana and Ayu. The guards fell back sullenly. The determination of these women warriors was not to be held lightly. One of the two priestesses who had been carried abreast of Leola in the afternoon procession, it was not the girl who had glanced at Chiron, advanced halfway the length of the tables and addressed Ayu. "By what right," she demanded, in a tone of arrogance and anger, "do your guards seize the person of our high priestess upon the Isle of Sele, within the holy borders of the shrine?" Ayu answered evenly. "The priests of Minos have always held the right of entry upon Sele." "But wait," he cried, as the priestess started to bring up her spear. "Hear me out. We followed in the footsteps of this stranger, believing that he intended to violate the sacred precincts of the Isle to keep a tryst with Leola." There was a movement of disbelief, of repulsion, among the priestesses, and their gaze fastened on Leola's face. "We found her," continued Ru, in his embrace. "She cannot deny it." "Ask her," he cried, as the priestesses protested in indignation. The spokeswoman turned to Leola, half fearfully. The unasked question was in her silent glance. "It is true," the high priestess admitted calmly. As swiftly as waves retreat from a sloping beach, the priestesses of Pasiphae drew back from Leola as a thing abhorred, whose touch would befoul them. Only one remained close to her. It was the one whom Chiron had called Lycida. She hesitated for a moment as the others moved away sullenly. Then she stepped to Leola's side, lifting her head fearlessly, and checked the high priestess before she could speak. "Then I, too," she said, looking scornfully at her fellows, "abjure my vows. My respect for her is stronger than my devotion to Pasiphae. The vows of friendship to flesh and blood are stronger than those to a goddess in the souls of whose followers humanity is as lifeless as the flame that died last night upon the altar of the shrine." Her voice rang out fearlessly, and her dark eyes flashed. "So be it," said Ru grimly. "You have cast your lot with flesh and blood, and your fate is entwined with the fate of Leola. The gods will appreciate another offering. Tomorrow, at dawn, you may have cause for regret when you face an offended Pasiphae at the entrance of the underworld." Lycida shivered, but stood as straight as an arrow. "We will give them into your keeping," continued Ru to the priestesses. "We will await you in the hall of sacrifice an hour before sunrise." It was a shrewd move that allied the irate votaries of Pasiphae with him in the judgment that he had declared. He had no wish to offend them at the present. There was time enough for that later on. The first priestess, whose eyes already held a look of satisfied ambition, hesitated for only a moment. At a sign from her, the armed priestesses closed in about Leola and her companion and led them from the hall. The sound of their departure had barely died away when there was a noise of confusion in the antechamber. The clang of a shield, the quick clatter of weapons, and the imperious voice of Chiron ordered the guards to stand aside. A little phalanx of nobles entered, swords in hand. They were armored in helmets, breastplates, and greaves, and their sword arms were protected from wrist to elbow by plates of bronze. With them were the personal attendants of the young king, the Indians Maya and Kolo who flanked Laidlaw, and Chiron himself. The scientist and the two Indians held rifles. Thrusting the guards aside, they surrounded Morse, their shields welded into an unbreakable barrier. "This time, you have usurped your prerogatives," said Chiron. "This man and this," he indicated Morse and Laidlaw, "can hardly be called strangers. On the contrary, they are citizens and nobles of Atlantis, members of the Brotherhood of Coal, Epopti and Misty of the ritual over which you presided. They can be judged only by the will of the people." Ru's face grew scarlet, and the veins on his forehead stood out as if he had been lashed. "This we will not countenance," he shrieked. "Our shrines have been profaned. Their lives are forfeit. Be careful that you do not involve yourself." He struck a gong that hung upon a tripod close by him. Above it sound broke a heavy detonation, and again the palace shook to its foundations. "Listen to the voice of Minos," cried Ru. "Atlantis is shaken. We lie in the hollow of his palm. Beware or he will close it and crush us." In answer to the sound of the gong, a company of guards appeared behind Ru to strengthen his position. Consternation reigned among the feasters. The violence of the tremor and the ferocity of Ru's speech frightened them, and the priest was quick to recognize this. The terror of the moment had invested him with all the ancient powers of his office. "Seize them," he cried, and the guards rushed at the little force who stood firm to the attack, outnumbered though they were. A clash of bronze upon bronze sounded as Chiron and his men fiercely resisted the crush of men who sought to cut them down by sheer weight of numbers. Morse and Laidlaw, joined by Maya and Kolo, forced their way into the front ranks, and opened fire, the first use of firearms that the Atlanteans had ever witnessed. The noise of the rifles and automatics was almost lost in the fierce combat, but Ayu's guards saw the spitting fire and shrank back before the stream of lead that smashed through flesh and bone and left a dozen of their number on the floor. Morse caught a glimpse of the head and shoulders of Ayu behind the mass of guards, and he fired without taking aim. The bullet smashed against the golden headpiece that the high priest wore and sent it banging to the floor. Ayu bobbed low with surprising alacrity and kept out of sight behind his guards. "Quickly," shouted Chiron, as the attack slackened. "Before they can cut us off." Still facing their opponents, the little band backed slowly through the door and then hastened along the corridor to Chiron's quarters. A few of the party had been wounded in the short conflict, and these were treated as Chiron revealed his doings to the Americans. "I sent a messenger to your apartments and learned from the Indians that you had left instructions not to be disturbed." After a little while Ayu was interrupted by some of his men who talked excitedly, although I could not hear what was said. An evil but satisfying look came over his face as he exchanged a word with Rana, and then his men rushed off with new instructions. "As soon as the opportunity presented itself, I slipped away to your apartments. Maya admitted that you were not there, and I set out to find you. The boat that I had lent you was gone, and a little distance from there I found a fisherman who told me of an incoming barge that held prisoners from Sele. Messages were sent to Laidlaw and these men whom I felt certain I could count on, and we armed ourselves. You know the rest. What do you know of Leola?" Morse told him, and the king's face became pale and hard as he heard of the devotion of the priestess, Lycida. "They left the palace by another way," he said slowly. "If I had met them—" He paused and let his sentence go unfinished, fighting deep emotion. Finally he gained control of himself. "We cannot stay here indefinitely. The doors are solid, but Ayu will inflame all of Atlantis against us. They are already in mortal fear from the earth tremors. The fisherman told me that the western waters are white with dead fish, and the paint on his boat was blistered with the heat. The volcanic cloud is red with the reflection of fire." He turned to the nobles who had fought for him. "I do not wish to embroil you in this quarrel, my friends. Yet, I am afraid that you are already marked men." "Your cause is ours, Chiron," one of them answered for all. "Good. If I can get word to my villa, there are 50 men there who are well trained in the use of arms. But our numbers will still remain too few," he mused sadly. "Leola and her friend must be rescued," interposed Morse quietly but firmly. "Ayu plans to sacrifice them at dawn. We must reach them somehow. A raid on Sele. We would be cut down before we reached the boats," said Chiron. Then a bold stroke in the temple. "Can you gain us in trance somehow? If we could hide ourselves until the right moment, seize the girls, and fight our way to the tunnel, we might have a chance. The guns will hold them off if we can take them by surprise." Chiron looked at Morse doubtfully. "It is the only thing we can do," he agreed finally. "It is a desperate chance. Your death tubes may aid us to win through, but I think Ayu will be certain to guard the tunnel. But I can gain access to the temple by the royal entrance. It opens only to my touch, and even Ayu does not have the secret. The passage leads from here to the chamber of Tele, the astrologer. He will help us, for he has no love for Ayu. The priests hate him because he will not read the stars to suit their will." A fierce hammering sounded on the metal doors that shut off the wing from the rest of the palace. Maya appeared to tell them that Ayu's forces had mustered for an attack. "If the doors will hold them for a while," said Morse, "we can collect our ammunition and make our way to your astrologer." On the outside, men battered savagely at the doors. It took only a few moments to secure the arms, the flashlights, and the field glasses. They stepped into the large room that housed the king's pool, and Chiron moved to its side, reaching for some unseen object beneath the water's surface. There was a rush of water, and the pool emptied rapidly. Chiron turned and motioned them down a flight of steps. Along the side of the pool, a series of bronze rings were set for handholds. The king inspected them carefully, selected one, and gave it a peculiar twist to the side. A low door appeared, and they passed through, followed by the nobles who had cast their lot with the king. The passage was pitch dark. Laidlaw switched on his flashlight, and by its light Chiron found a lever set in the wall. As he pulled it, the door behind them closed quickly, and the sound of water was easily distinguishable. The pool was being refilled. "The doors should hold them," said Chiron hopefully. "I made sure that they were well built. By the time they have them down, the pool will have reached its normal level. Let me lead. There are other tricks that make this hidden way secure." Chapter 12. The Hall of Sacrifice. The hidden way led downward with sudden dips and turns. Along the route they passed through two ancient doors, both several inches thick and encased in metal. They were opened only after Chiron had spoken through a tube and set in motion delicately balanced machinery that was controlled by the action of a diaphragm. Finally, they came to the end of the passage, to face a blank wall. Silencing his companions, Chiron blew into a pipe that ran into the wall. For a minute nothing happened, and then a soft, muffled whistle penetrated back through the tube. Laidlaw and Morse exchanged glances as Chiron spoke swiftly into the tube and stepped back. The wall slid silently away, and they crowded into a room that was almost filled by the numbers of their party. An old man, bowed nearly double, so that his straggling beard swept the floor, greeted them. The men of the king's party moved a step backward, involuntarily, awed to be in the presence of the astrologer who could read in the stars the secrets of their life and death. The stargazer wore a black robe emblazoned with rayed discs worked in gold and silver. On his breast was the representation of the sun, centered by an opal that changed color at every laboring breath. His hands shook palsidly. The wrinkled skin of his face held the unhealthy pallor of shadowed fungi. Only his two eyes lived, and they mated the opal of the ornament. His first words halted the king's speech. "I expected you, Chiron," he said simply, in a deep voice that was astonishingly vibrant. "You and the strangers. The stars have told me." He pointed to a circular stone on which was engraved a mass of symbols. "In the month of Pasiphae, in this generation, disaster shall come to Atlantis. Disaster from within and without. The appointed time is here. As the stars are born in flame and perish in dead ashes, so nations rise and fall as the gods have appointed. Still, the children of Atlantis will not perish in entirety. In an alien land, he pointed a wavering finger at Chiron, will survive with the priestess you love. In the far days to come, your son's son shall once again rule the people of Minos. And he fixed his lustrous eyes upon a fascinated Morse, you, too shall breed those who will restore the ancient glory of Atlantis. Last night, I read the stars. Soon you will travel beneath constellations I have never seen, yet ones I know well. You will tread a path laid out eons before you drew your first breath. I have prophesied this to Ru and his priests, but because I have refused to twist the inexorable law that is written in the sky to their ambitions, I am discredited. What is your will? Chiron explained quickly, and the sage nodded. Rest in the best manner that you can until I call you, he said. I go to read the symbols of the night. No one will suspect your presence here. Will you come with me, man of another land? He asked Laidlaw. My time is short, and yet I would exchange knowledge with you. The brain may die, but knowledge is incorruptible. When we return I will place you behind the calendar disc in a hollow that is unknown to Ru. The disc is pierced in its carving, and you can observe all that passes, and at the chosen moment enter the temple. The way is difficult, and the omens tell of hardship and death. Yet courage will take you to your end. Laidlaw and the astrologer disappeared up a narrow, winding stair, and the party relaxed as far as cramped quarters would permit. There could be no thought of sleep in the anxiety of what was to come, and presently Chiron arose. "The way should be clear now," he said. "I will return to my quarters by the way that we entered, and then leave the palace in disguise. We can use the men who are at my villa. I think the tunnel to the outer world will be guarded, but there is an old exit at the northern end of the lake that was closed many years ago. Still, we may be able to open it if we can get that far." Morse tried to dissuade him, but the king was resolute. "We must have more men," he said, and Morse reluctantly acknowledged this. Even with the advantage given them by their firearms, they would be smothered quickly by the sheer weight of the numbers opposing them. Chiron departed, and the moments dragged until Telly and Laidlaw returned. "There are 2 hours left before daylight," said Laidlaw, "and the night is almost as bright as day with the reflection from the volcano. Unless I miss my guess, we're going to see an eruption within 24 hours. We counted for shocks while we were on the parapet, and the city is beginning to awaken. Ayu has sent messengers out to keep the people informed." "Damn him," said Morse. "I won't miss the next time I get a shot at him. Did you see anything of Chiron?" "We didn't see him, and we were careful not to expose ourselves," said Laidlaw, once Morse had explained the king's errand. "There are many boats on the lake. The priestesses from Sele have arrived, and we heard them chanting." Aside to Morse, he said, "Telly has cast his lot with us. By giving us sanctuary he will be linked to us the moment we show ourselves from behind the calendar stone. He is a rare mixture of shrewdness and more than a smattering of real science. I hope we can take him back with us. I like him. You haven't brought anything along to eat, have you?" "Not I," Morse answered. "Didn't you satisfy yourself at the feast?" "My mouth was filled with words when it should have been full of meat," said Laidlaw wryly. "I'm afraid you'll be long hungry before our next meal. We've got to be moving." They filed down a slanting corridor to find themselves in a circular chamber closed by a great circle of stone slitted with deep carving on its unexposed side. The flashlight showed a bronze pipe that was fitted with a mouthpiece leading to a box-like affair above the stone. "Telly's private megaphone by which he spouts his oracles," guessed Laidlaw. He switched off his flashlight at the astrologer's directive. They crowded around the openings that looked into the hall of sacrifice. The darkness harbored them, and they waited, fingering their weapons nervously. Suddenly, lights appeared in the inner chamber. The hall was revealed in all its vastness, a forbidding place carved from solid rock. Frescoes of frightening sacrificial rites decorated the walls. Directly in line with the calendar stone was an altar, a high platform built of massive blocks on which rested a golden flower, its petals closed upon its center. Above it loomed the savage figure of the deity, cross-legged, clad in a loincloth, a mighty idol with the head of a bull. Its eyes glowed crimson, and one hand held a torch that spouted a flame of natural gas. The other held a golden goblet. Steps led up to the altar, and on either side stood 2 thrones of marble. A murmur of voices reached the ears of the hidden people. Before them Ayu and his attendants entered the chamber and prostrated themselves before the altar. They were clad in ceremonial vestments that fairly coruscated with gems and polished metal. Morse's finger itched on the trigger of his pistol. Only the knowledge that a shot would destroy all chances of saving Leola restrained him. A priest advanced to a pillar that was hewn in rough semblance of a human figure with bowed shoulders that supported the roof of the chamber. He pressed a center spot in the carved figure. Slowly the petals of the flower lifted and fell back until they formed the rays of the sun about a transparent center of crystal through which shone a ruddy glow. Another man worked a lever from behind one of the thrones. A grating noise could be heard. Ayu and the priests stepped rapidly aside as a portion of floor opened before them, and the chamber was filled with the glare and heat of a roaring furnace. Tongues of fierce flame increased the temperature perceptibly before the opening closed again. "The spot of sacrifice," whispered Laidlaw. connected by a shaft with the volcano itself, I think. At dawn, the sun shines through a crack that penetrates the roof and faces the east. The gem is the finger of Minos which stirs his emblem, the sunflower, to life. With its opening the shaft is uncovered, and the victim is hot into the incandescent lava. Of course the sunbeam is a theatrical trick. The devilish invention works mechanically. But the finger of Minos is a vital part of the ritual that ties it to the supernatural. And Sele declares it will not pierce the slit today, though there is no eclipse due. He thinks the smoke from the volcano will veil the sun, and he's probably right. It should put a hitch in our use ceremonial. I hope so, said Morse anxiously. I'm afraid something may have happened to Chiron. He's got to be here before daylight to do us any good or to avoid discovery. Ayu and his followers, satisfied that the hellish machinery was in working order, departed. The lights still burned in the hall of sacrifice, and from beyond the walls the silent watchers could hear the faint sound of chanting. After a time, a column of guards filed in and fixed ropes to keep back the populace who were never allowed too close to the divine mysteries. When this was completed, some of the men took up stations by the main entrance, and the crowd swarmed in. Their murmur of conversation was subdued in the presence of the god and the nature of the circumstance. Finally, Ayu and his train made their entrance. In another part of the chamber, a door opened, and the sound of chanting became clear and loud. The priestesses of Pasiphae, their white and silver vestments changed for robes of sambre purple that was almost a black, marched toward the altar. In their midst Leola and Lycidas walked with heads erect. 4 of the priests received the victims, as the priestesses took up a station to the right of the altar, standing opposite to the attendants of Ayu. There was a long pause. In the hidden cavity behind the calendar stone, Morse and Laidlaw could hear the beating of their hearts as they prayed for Chiron's coming. They counted a double company of guards within the hall of sacrifice, and another detachment entered in company with Rana, who passed by Leola with a look of triumph. She seated herself majestically on one of the thrones, while the other, the throne of Chiron, remained empty. The priests of Minos began a sacred song to the sun. Ayu stood in an expectant attitude, glancing above him to the cut in the roof through which the sunbeam would fall. The 4 priests bound the feet of the victims, and Leola was left standing on the spot of sacrifice. At Sele's bidding, the little company grouped to one side behind the calendar stone. The astrologer readied himself to touch the mechanism that would swing the stone on a pivot, watching Morse intently. Morse, in turn, watched every move of the priests for the first suggestion of a movement that would cause the flower to open. But Ayu cast anxious looks at the slot above him. The lights had been lowered to make the appearance of the sunbeam more effective, but nothing happened. Twice the priests repeated the final phrases of their chant. The sun god comes in flame. Hail unto Re, all hail. Acclaim his sacred name to Re, all hail. No finger of light appeared. The people shifted uneasily, and a deep voice sounded. Re refuses the sacrifice. He shines not upon deeds that are unjust. It was the voice of the oracle. For a moment even Ayu was startled. Morse could see the frightened eyes of the guards as Sele's impressive voice boomed through his megaphone. He had confided the secret of the sunbeam's non-appearance. The earthquake had loosened courses from the roof, but, with characteristic mystery, reserved this knowledge until it became necessary to use every second of delay. Ayu grew furious, aware that his own tricks were being used against him. He faced the people knowing that he must act without delay. By Re and Minos, he cried, the oracle speaks falsely. The sun is veiled by the smoke from the volcano. But its power can pierce the cloud. Look! The sunflower opens. A priest had moved silently to the pillar and touched the hidden stud. The rays began to lift. A second priest advanced toward the lever that would precipitate Leola into the shaft as the heart of the flower was disclosed. The calendar stone revolved on its edge, and Morse, Laidlaw, and their band swept into the temple. Laidlaw fired at the priest, who dodged unhurt behind Rana's throne as soon as he caught sight of them. Morse caught Leola to his side, while Rana, maddened by rage and jealousy, leaped at her sister with an upraised knife. From behind the throne Ru cried out to stop her, but the queen gave him not so much as a look. At that moment a portion of the floor rolled back, and a great tongue of flame shot almost to the temple roof. Rana shrieked, dropped her weapon, and covered her face with her hands, seared and blinded with the leaping flames. She tottered and fell forward with a hideous shriek into the shaft of death. The temple became a bedlam. The guards fell back momentarily, then attacked the band with fury, pressing them back toward the calendar stone. Suddenly, Chiron appeared behind them with a body of 50 men, and the guards fell back before these new reinforcements. The king moved forward swiftly and pulled Lycida from the arms of a pair of Ru's henchmen who had sought to push her into the flames. For a moment, there was a lull in the fighting, and then Ru's strong voice called out. He urged the multitude to avenge their queen and the profanation of the temple, and the spectators, who had been silent spectators to the fierce battle, looked at each other dumbly. Ru's urging was renewed, and then with a thunderous roar the mob surged forward. Morse had time to set Leola behind the stone, and then joined Laidlaw and the two Indians in a fusillade at their attackers. But the wave could not be stopped, the numbers were too great. Telly was down, gasping his life away with a great wound in his breast. And Chiron himself was hard-pressed until Laidlaw, noticing the king's peril, shot two of his closest adversaries. Ru, his passion kindled by the overpowering rush of the multitude, forgot his danger in the impending victory. He moved from his sanctuary behind the throne, shrieking his hate. And for just a moment he was revealed to Morse. The American steadied himself and his aim was true. A crimson star blazed on the forehead of the high priest, and he screamed, spun wildly, and plunged headlong into the fiery pit. In the next minute the band was behind the great stone, and Chiron fumbled for the hidden spring. He found it, and the ponderous mass shut out the furious attackers. Chapter 13. The End of Atlantis. For what seemed like hours, but what was in reality only a few minutes, Chiron and his companions traversed unused passages until they had reached the street. As they emerged from the palace, the earth shook violently, and a number of men were thrown to the ground. The sky was leaden where the great pool of the volcano shifted above the city, lit up by sudden flashes. The lake was covered with waves in which fish floated by the thousands, and steam hung above the surface like a low fog. Here and there along the causeway sections of cornices had fallen. Apparently tremors, which had gone unnoticed in the low level of the temple during the intense fighting, had been occurring with greater frequency. Chiron led them to the boats in which he had landed his men. As the band showed themselves on the main causeway, howls of rage greeted them. Behind them, they saw the first ranks of the infuriated populace, some of the guards, and a few of the bolder priests, who burst from the temple entrance like angry hornets. The boats were boarded and pushed into the lake with less than 100 feet to spare, but the pursuers poured into other vessels, and their oars lashed the water to a frenzied foam. Morse, Laidlaw, and the two Indians sought to discourage them with their rifles, but the odds were too great. And many of the pursuing craft, with 2 tiers of oars, were gradually overhauling them. "We'll have to land on Sele," shouted Chiron. "We can fight them from the water stairs and have the temple to fall back to." "We'll have to watch out or they'll flank us," said Morse, remembering the cove. "Are there any other landing places besides that one they used to capture us?" he asked Leola. "There are none," she answered. "Then Maya and Kolo can guard the cove with 12 men and their guns. If only we had more rifles." The little group moved away quickly, following the Indians. There was little time for talk, barely time to range themselves upon the shallow steps of Sele, before the leading galley moved alongside, and the fight was on again. Morse and Laidlaw checked the first attack, but ammunition was running low. Moreover, their opponents were now fully convinced that the volcanic eruption and earthquake were caused by the actions of the priestess and the outsiders, and they fought desperately. Soon, the lower steps were covered with dead and dying, but the attack did not waver. Step by step the little force retreated, fighting tenaciously. Behind shields set edge to edge, they wielded their swords, while those in the second line flung short javelins or thrust with long spears. The defenders held the advantage of the steps which had been hewn from the rocky bed of the island. Yet, they were rolled back inevitably toward the temple. 3 galleys had landed, and in the distance additional ships were leaving the city. The guards, trained fighters that they were, fought like fiends. Their giant leader appeared invulnerable as he swung his axe with frightful and deadly dexterity, changing it to either hand as the occasion demanded and shouting wild cries to which his henchmen responded. Chiron attacked him and was beaten to his knees, recovering under the prompt covering of friendly shields. At last the little band of defenders found themselves unable to retreat. They had been backed against the columns of the temple. Laidlaw and Morse were close beside each other when they fired their last cartridges. Morse stooped to secure a spear, and, as he rose, the giant guardsman, cleaving a way through the wavering ranks, charged at him. His swift leap evaded Morse's spear thrust, and with a shout of triumph he leaped in, axe swinging high. Morse was off balance, and there was no aid at hand. Laidlaw was throttling an assailant in his powerful hands, and the balance of Chiron's men were reeling in near exhaustion. Before Morse could ready himself for a defense, something whistled past his ear. The giant guardsman, with a look of astonishment, dropped his axe and flung up both arms. From his broad chest protruded the feathered shaft of an arrow. Others began to fly, 2 in a volley, straight to their marks. Morse secured the bronze battle-axe that had threatened him and turned to see Leola and her companion, Lycida, loosing arrow after arrow against their attackers. There were no bows to be used in retaliation. The weapon had become almost obsolete and was used only by the priestesses of Pasiphae as a sacred symbol. Morse waved at Leola, and she called out encouragement. Laidlaw had found a sword and was swinging it around him with unquenchable fury, the great scientist lost in a berserk madness. Morse, axe in hand, fought to his side, and together they inspired a rally that drove back the attackers. As the fighting ceased, Maya and Kolo came up on the run, followed closely by the men who had been dispatched to guard the other landing. They reported that an earthquake had closed the cove, squeezing the rocks into a high dike. These reinforcements were welcome, particularly the weapons with the few remaining cartridges. But it could only be the beginning of the end. Less than a dozen of the initial force remained on their feet. The survivors were wounded, bruised, almost too weary to lift their weapons. 20 boats were on the lake, bringing certain death closer at every oar pull. In the breathing space allotted by fate they greeted each other with grim smiles. The 2 priestesses stood close to the men they had chosen over their vows, and Laidlaw surveyed them with looks of kindly sympathy. The scientist looked like a Viking warrior, with his hair and beard in a ruffled manner. Bare from the waist, his body was splotched with blood, and there was a nasty cut on one forearm. He had set a helmet on his head, and a gory sword was still clutched in one hand. "It's a good way to go out," he grinned. "I've always thought I'd like to be in one good, smashing fight. And we've had it. EY. Here they come." The lovers embraced for a final time. The flotilla was less than 100 yards away, and shouts of vengeance carried from them. The 3 galleys that had first pursued them floated idly, covered with dead and dying, a monument to the bravery of the hunted. But less than 20 remained able to give battle to an enemy numbering more than 1,000. A frightful roar came from the volcano. The cloud pall shook and scattered as flames shot up. The crate. A lip became a molten mass that slowly moved down the steep slopes, erasing the snow. The island quivered, shook. Behind them temple columns toppled and crashed down. The water stairs were split in two, the edges grinding and working hungrily against each other. A great wave suddenly slapped at the land and sent its scalding spray among them. The men in the boats ceased to row. A second lava overflow spilled from the crater in time with a second shock. Leola clutched at Morse's arm. "Look," she cried, pointing to the northern shore. The wall of the lake was opening. The mountain dissolved before their eyes, a great wedge splitting below the water line. Clouds of fine ash began to fall, covering the lake with scum and the land with fine powder that choked them. The boats were now rowing frantically for the farther shore. "They'll never make it," said Laidlaw. "The current will grip them. They'll go over that Niagara, listen to the sound of it. The lake's emptying. Damn these ashes, my mouth's full of them." They climbed the shattered steps and entered the half-ruined temple. Leola led them to an inner chamber where they found food and drink. And somehow they ate by the light of a pair of torches. The temple lights had been destroyed, and the sifting ashes turned the day to a choking twilight. The volcanic dust became unbearable, and they descended into the temple crypts, where flashlight rays exposed rows of skeletons in niches hollowed from the rock. Laidlaw examined the latter. "Lava," he said. "The whole island's built out of it. These tunnels are of volcanic formation. I'm afraid that we and Atlantis are going to go out together." Morse took Leola in his arms. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Afraid? Of what? No matter where the path leads, we go down it together." "I believe we'll get clear," said Chiron optimistically. "Do you remember Telly's prediction? That with courage we would win through? I have faith in that last oracle of his. He was generally too correct to be popular." Encouraged by Chiron, they fought the hours in silence. No ashes reached them, but the air grew foul and hot. Twice earth tremors of lessening violence loosened ancient skeletons upon them. Gradually the temperature increased until they could endure it no longer. "Lava rising in the old channels," announced Laidlaw. But the shock seemed to have ended. "Suppose we take a look." The world on which they gazed was new to them. The wan rays of the setting sun shone tired and old upon a grey landscape. The volcanic ash had ceased to fall, but everywhere there was a fine dust, uprooted trees, damaged buildings, all powdered to the same dreary shade. The water stairs, what was left of them, ended in a sheer drop to what had been the lake. The water had fallen 30 feet, and the turbid current swirled slowly toward the gap in the mountains through which it still poured with the noise of a distant cataract. There was not a boat to be seen. The city of Dor stood upon cliffs. Many of its buildings had fallen, and its palace and temple were on fire. Little remained that had escaped nature's hand of destruction. Nor was there any sign of human survival. The volcano vomited its pall of smoke, black above, blood-red below, and the slow lava stream had almost reached the line of trees. Everything was dull with the grey film that floated in patches upon the dying lake. Here was the abomination of desolation. "Not a cheerful outlook," said Morse. "But it is an outlook." "There are no boats," said Chiron. "There are trees," Morse answered. "We can build a raft." 3 months later there was talk across the table in Morse's dining room. "I think I'll go back to Atlantis," said Laidlaw. Chiron made a face. "Haven't you had enough of destruction?" he asked. Laidlaw smiled. "I don't think you four have been married long enough for me to coax away the grooms, but I want to finish my researches, and with Chiron's permission I'm going to form a company." "A company for what?" asked Chiron. "And why with my permission?" "Because you should have the first claim on it. The lake bottom off the temple water stairs ought to be high and dry by now. There's a fortune lying there in gold and jewels to be picked up." "Getting a mercenary streak," Laidlaw, laughed Morse. "Money is always useful, if only to leave to godchildren, answered the scientist. I'll use most of it for archaeological researches, with the exception of the possible legacies just mentioned. Want to come with me, Chiron? The late king of Atlantis shook his head. We haven't started on what you call our honeymoon yet. Better come with us, Laidlaw. We are going to spend it in Crete. A lot of company you'd be to me, or I to you, said the scientist. I prefer Atlantis. How about you, Morse? Think of the treasure trove we can uncover. I think, said Morse, as his hand closed over that of Leola's, that as far as I'm concerned, I have the treasure of Atlantis.